If you're ready to dive into one of the most unexpected, heart-pounding, and ultimately heartwarming encounters humanity has ever had with the galaxy's apex predators, make sure you hit that like button, drop a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because this is the day we learned why even predators trust humans with their cubs. The canopy swallowed the daylight. Strange calls echoed through the humid air, layered like overlapping languages. Captain Elias Cade crouched low, one knee sinking into the spongy moss, scanning the undergrowth with his rifle slung across his back. He wasn't hunting. He was observing. Varthuan was a world that never slept, and the Vorkathi were the reason no one sane tried to tame it. Beside him, two members of his research crew, Ramos, a wiry xenobiologist, and Ellis, their medic, moved in careful unison. Behind them, a field drone hovered, silently logging temperature, humidity, and the barely audible subsonic pulses from somewhere deeper in the jungle. Those pulses weren't random. Cade had learned enough in his 6 months here to know they were territorial warnings. Vorkathi territory. The Vorkathi weren't just predators, they were the predators. Apex hunters who had ruled their world's evolutionary ladder for millennia. Standing close to 3 meters when upright, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, they resembled a nightmare blend of wolf and tiger, their fur patterned in streaks of midnight and burnished gold. Every record in Galactic Wildlife Authority files marked them as unapproachable, observed from distance. And yet, Elias Cade was here, less than a kilometer from a Vorkathi den. It wasn't recklessness that brought him here. It was curiosity, and something harder to name. His career had been built on walking the fine edge between danger and respect, between the need to understand and the instinct to survive. Vorkathi were solitary around outsiders, but their social bonds within the pack were ironclad, especially toward their young. The first growl was low enough that Ramos thought it was a trick of the wind. Cade froze, raising a hand for silence. The underbrush ahead trembled, not with the subtle stir of small prey, but with the heavy rhythmic crunch of something large forcing its way through. Ararkath stepped into the clearing. Even for a Vorkathi he was immense. His head alone looked capable of crushing a man's skull, his claws thick and curved like hooked blades. Across his chest, fresh blood, bright and steaming, matting his fur in uneven streaks. One ear was torn, his breathing ragged. The ground seemed smaller beneath his weight. Behind him, shadows shifted. Other Vorkathi, younger, less scarred, eyes bright with the heat of battle. Their flanks were streaked with dirt and blood from the fight Cade now realized had been happening just beyond hearing. The rival predators were gone. They had not left willingly. Arakatha's gaze locked onto him. Not the crew, not the hovering drone, just him. The amber in his eyes seemed to burn with its own light, unblinking, measuring. Cade felt Ramos stiffen beside him, fingers twitching toward his tranq rifle. Cade didn't move. Predators read fear like a map. Then, from behind Ararkath, another form appeared, smaller, staggering. A Vorkathi female, her movements unsteady, muzzle smeared with blood that was not all from her prey. She carried something in her jaws, 2 tiny bundles each barely the size of a human infant. Cubs. Their fur was still in that mottled, awkward stage of newborn life, eyes half shut, bodies trembling from shock. She set them down at Arakatha's feet and collapsed, a sound escaping her that was part growl, part whimper. Even from here Cade could see the wound, deep, tearing, fatal. She wouldn't last the hour. Arakath lowered his massive head to her, touching his nose to hers in silence. Then she went still. The jungle was quiet now, save for the restless rustle of leaves in the wind. Arakath turned back toward Cade. Slowly, deliberately he picked up both cubs by the scruff, stepped forward, and crossed the clearing until there was no more than 5 meters between them. Ramos whispered, "What is he?" but Cade's raised hand cut him off. Arakath set the cubs down. For a moment he loomed over them, his bulk casting them in shadow. Then he straightened, gaze never leaving Cade's, and stepped back. 1 pace. 2. His posture changed, not threatening, not defensive. Expectant. Cade understood without understanding why. Every story, every fragment of Vorkathi lore he'd studied told him this was impossible. No Vorkathi would entrust their young to an outsider. But the cubs were too young to survive alone, and the rest of the Vorkathi here were still circling warily, unsure if the human was friend or prey. He crouched, slowly so the cubs could see his hands. One whimpered, a high, thin sound. The other bared tiny needle teeth but didn't back away. Gently, Cade slid his hands under their fragile bodies, feeling their rapid heartbeats against his palms. Behind him, Ellis muttered, "This is insane, Cap." "Quiet," Cade said, his voice low but steady. The cubs were warm, trembling, and far too light. He rose with them, their fur damp against his shirt. When he looked up again, Arakath had taken one step closer. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat Cade felt as though he'd been weighed and measured by something older than words. The Vorkathi leader's jaws parted slightly, and a sound came, harsh, guttural, but unmistakable in intent. Protect. It wasn't just the word. It was the way it was said, the rumble in it, as if the predator was pressing the entire weight of his will into that single command. Cade nodded once. I will. Something passed between them then, invisible but real as gravity. Arakath stepped back into the shadows of his pack, watching, but no longer blocking the way. The Vorkathi made no move to stop Cade and his crew as they began the slow, careful trek back through the jungle. The cubs stirred against him, one letting out a small, almost questioning sound. The heat of their bodies seeped through his arms. Around them, the jungle came alive again, distant calls resuming as if the world had decided, for now, that this was no longer a battlefield. By the time the trees began to thin and the first shapes of their forward camp came into view, Cade knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever came next, whatever lines they had just crossed in Vorkathi culture, there was no going back. And somewhere behind him, hidden in the green depths, a predator was watching. Waiting to see if the human would keep his word. The cubs were restless long before they reached camp. Cade could feel their tiny claws pricking through his shirt, their breathing uneven, their small bodies shifting as though seeking something they couldn't find. Ramos hurried ahead to prepare the heated containment cradle, while Ellis unpacked his field med kit, already muttering about dosage conversions for alien physiology. The moment they stepped inside the largest tent, the air seemed to thicken. Vorkathi scent clung to the cubs, spice and iron, heat and wild musk, and it made every piece of equipment feel suddenly out of place. These creatures didn't belong in sterile canvas walls or under the hum of portable lamps. They belonged in dens carved from living stone, beneath skies thick with stars. Cade eased them into the cradle. The smaller one curled immediately into a tight ball, eyes squeezed shut. The larger stayed upright, fixing him with a gaze far too direct for its age. He had seen that look before, in Arakatha's eyes, moments before the impossible trust had been given. Ellis leaned in with a scanner, frowning. Vitals are weak. They need nutrients and fast. Formula's tricky, wrong amino sequence could kill them. We have predator serum samples from the supply vault, Ramos offered. We can synthesize. A shadow fell across the tent's entrance. Vorkathi. Not Arakath but three others, warriors by the look of them, their fur marked with claw scars, their amber eyes sharp with suspicion. They ducked inside without waiting for permission, the tent's poles groaning under their weight. The tallest stepped forward, teeth bared, not in threat but in what passed for a warning. His voice was thick with an accent, but the words were clear enough. Cubs. Ours. Return them. Cade straightened. They're injured. They won't survive the night without treatment. You are not Vorkathi, the warrior growled. You do not know our young. I know when something's dying, Cade replied, his tone flat, calm and without challenge. And I know Arakath gave them to me. Do you want to explain to him why you took them back before they were safe? That landed. The warrior's ears twitched back, his gaze flickering to the cubs and then away. He didn't leave but he stepped aside, his companions watching with unblinking intensity as Ellis began preparing a nutrient solution. Feeding was a careful, almost surgical act. The cradle's heating coils glowed softly, keeping their body temperature stable. Ellis adjusted the feed line, holding the first bottle near the smaller cub's muzzle. For a tense moment it didn't react. Then a small rasping sound, half growl, half sigh, and it latched on, drawing the liquid in slow pulls. The larger cub resisted, swiping with tiny claws until Cade took the bottle himself. He knelt, meeting its unsteady glare, and held the tip just close enough for it to smell. The growl softened to a questioning whine. When it finally bit down on the feeder, its teeth pricked his skin. Blood welled from the shallow cut. The Vorkathi warriors stiffened, their hackles rising, but Cade didn't flinch. He let the cub feed, ignoring the warm trickle down his hand. Across the tent, the tallest warrior tilted his head in what might have been grudging acknowledgement. By nightfall the cubs were fed and sleeping, their breathing deeper, steadier. The Vorkathi still lingered at the tent's entrance, silent sentinels. Arakath had not appeared, but Cade felt his absence like a weight. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was awareness that everything here balanced on a thread. The balance nearly broke in the early hours. Cade was on watch when the first sound came, a faint chittering almost like insects, It grew louder, sharper, until the night outside seemed alive with movement. The Vorkathi warriors tensed, heads snapping toward the jungle. Something was coming. Shapes emerged from the dark. Scavenger predators, smaller than Vorkathi, but numerous, their spindly limbs ending in hooks, their jaws lined with needle teeth. They moved like water spilling into the camp, their eyes reflecting the lamplight in fractured shards. The Vorkathi warriors roared, surging forward to meet them. Cade spun toward the cradle. One scavenger had slipped past the fight, its body low, its movements impossibly fast. It was already halfway to the cubs. He drew his knife, no time for the rifle, and lunged. The blade sank into the creature's side, hot blood splashing his arm. It shrieked, clawing at him, but he twisted the knife and forced it back. Another came at him from the left, jaws snapping. He barely brought his forearm up in time, the bite crushing down on his armor plating. Pain flared, but he drove the knife into its throat and shoved it away. The tent shuddered with the weight of bodies outside. He could hear Ramos shouting, Ellis cursing, the Vorkathi roars blending with the unearthly screeches of the scavengers. Then a deeper roar cut through them all. Ararkath. He hit the fight like a thunderclap, his massive frame tearing through scavengers with terrifying efficiency. Claws raked, jaws snapped, and bodies fell. Cade caught sight of him just as a scavenger leapt from the shadows toward Cade's back. He didn't have time to turn. Ararkath slammed into it mid-air, ripping it aside with one swipe. Blood splattered across the tent wall. For a fraction of a second, Cade and Ararkath stood back to back, the air thick with heat and the metallic tang of blood. Then they moved again, Cade driving his knife into the last scavenger inside the tent, Ararkath breaking the neck of the one that had tried to flank him. When it was over, the ground outside was littered with bodies. The Vorkathi warriors stood panting, fur bristling, but uninjured. Inside, the cubs hadn't stirred, the cradle's insulation shielding them from the chaos. Ararkath stepped into the tent. His gaze went first to the cubs, then to Cade. Slowly, he lowered himself to one knee, a posture Cade had never seen from him. He reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew a small vial filled with a thick amber liquid. He held it out. For wounds, he said, his voice a low rumble. Cade took it, the warmth of the vial seeping into his palm. What is it? Ararkath's gaze didn't waver. Sap. From the heart tree. Only for kin. There was no mistaking the meaning. Kin, to a Vorkathi, was not a word given lightly. Cade applied the sap to the cut on his hand, the sting fading almost immediately. Outside, the camp began to settle, but the night's weight lingered. He could feel it in the way the Vorkathi warriors glanced at him now, not with suspicion but with something sharper, something that felt like evaluation. The cubs stirred in their sleep, one letting out a soft sound as though sensing the shift. Cade glanced at Ararkath, who still watched him in silence. You came fast, Cade said quietly. Ararkath's jaw flexed, the closest thing Cade had ever seen to a smile. I gave them to you. You keep them alive, you keep my trust. It wasn't a threat. It was a truth heavy and absolute. Cade nodded once. I will. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Ararkath rose, his shadow filling the tent, and left without another word. Cade stood there, the vial of sap still warm in his hand, knowing the line between them had shifted again, and wondering what would happen when that line was tested next. The smaller cub stopped eating 2 days later. At first it was subtle, slower to respond when Cade stroked its back, eyes duller, movements less certain. By nightfall, it lay curled in the heated cradle, shivering despite the regulated warmth. Alice's scans told the rest of the story. A bacterial parasite was in its bloodstream, something Vorkathi immune systems could fight naturally but that would overwhelm the cub before it grew strong enough. The only cure was an enzyme produced by a predator that lived in the mountains to the north, the Skyfang serpent. Ellis didn't bother hiding his frustration. It's a nightmare to get to. Vertical terrain, thin atmosphere, and the damn thing's venomous enough to kill you before you can blink. We don't have the gear for a clean capture, and even if we did, Cade's voice cut through. We're not letting it die. The tent seemed to tighten around those words. Ramos glanced at the Vorkathi warriors at the entrance, who listened without expression, though their eyes had narrowed. One of them slipped out into the night, silent as a shadow. Less than an hour later, Ararkath arrived. He didn't need Alice's translation of the scans. One look at the cub and he understood. His ears angled forward, his eyes burning with something between fear and resolve. When Alice explained the cure, Ararkath didn't hesitate. I know the path. I go with you. It wasn't phrased as an offer. Cade didn't treat it like one. They left before dawn. The mountains loomed as jagged silhouettes against the pale sky, their slopes shrouded in mist that burned away in the rising sun. The journey began in the dense jungle, each step a negotiation with roots and hidden drops, the air thick and wet. As the ground rose, the heat faded, replaced by a sharp cold that bit through clothing and fur alike. Travel with Arakath was a study in contrast. On the ground, he moved with a predator's efficiency, conserving energy, senses always scanning. In the rare pauses, he seemed restless, testing the air with quick turns of his head, his ears flicking at sounds Cade couldn't hear. He had little patience for human rations, sniffing once at the protein bars before tossing them back and tearing into a strip of dried Vorkathi meat instead. "You ever try eating one of your ration packs?" Cade asked during one rest. Arakatha's jaw flexed in something that might have been a smile. "I prefer food that lived." The climb grew harder as they reached the lower ridges. Loose stone shifted under their boots and claws. The mist was gone now, replaced by wind that sliced across the slopes, carrying the faint, metallic tang of the serpent's scent. At least that's what Arakath claimed. Cade couldn't smell anything but rock and cold. They found the serpent near midday, coiled in the shadow of a jagged spire. It was larger than Cade had imagined, its scales catching the light like shards of glass, each movement fluid and deliberate. Venom dripped from its fangs in slow, gleaming beads. Its head tracked them from a distance, unblinking, the flick of its tongue tasting the air. Cade unslung his rifle, but Arakath lifted a hand. "It must be alive when we take what we need. Dead, the enzyme fades." "Then how do you?" The serpent struck. Arakatha's roar split the air as he met its lunge head-on, claws raking across its neck. Cade circled wide, looking for an opening, the rifle useless at this range. The serpent twisted, its tail whipping out and catching Arakath in the ribs, sending him skidding across the rock. He rolled to his feet as though nothing had happened, launching himself back at it with reckless force. Cade spotted his chance when the serpent reared to strike again. He drew the flare gun from his belt, fired directly at its face. The burst of light and heat made it recoil, hissing. Arakath seized the moment, clamping his jaws around the base of its skull while his claws pinned its body. The serpent writhed, scales scraping against stone, but it was trapped. "Now!" Arakath barked. Cade moved in, pulling the extraction kit from his pack. The serpent's head twisted toward him, and for an instant he saw his own reflection in the black pools of its eyes. He slid the injector into the venom gland, drawing the viscous, shimmering fluid into the vial. His hands were steady, but the wind carried the serpent's heat and scent to him, raising every instinct to move faster. He had just sealed the vial when the serpent's tail lashed out again. It caught his leg, sending him sprawling. His rifle clattered away, and then the head was above him, jaws wide, fangs descending. The impact never came. Arakatha's body slammed into the serpent's side, knocking it off balance. In the scramble, one fang scraped across Cade's arm. It was only a shallow cut, but the burn started instantly, spreading like liquid fire through his veins. Arakath ripped the serpent away from him, driving it hard into the rock until its body went limp. The vial was still in Cade's hand, but his fingers were going numb. He didn't remember being lifted, only the steady rhythm of Arakatha's breathing and the cold bite of the wind as they began the descent. The venom blurred everything into fragments. The crunch of stone underfoot, the way Arakatha's grip never loosened, the sound of his voice rumbling something low and insistent in his own language. By the time they reached the jungle's edge, Cade's head was swimming, his limbs heavy. Arakath knelt, tore open the serpent's body, and smeared its blood directly onto the wound. The burning eased, replaced by a spreading warmth that dulled the edges of the pain. They reached camp as the sun was sinking, shadows long across the ground. Alice rushed to take the vial, disappearing into the med tent. Arakath set Cade down gently, his eyes flicking once toward the cradle. The cub was still alive, though its breaths were shallow. Alice worked quickly, the enzyme blending into the nutrient solution, the feed line adjusted. They watched as the cub swallowed, its tiny muscles twitching with the effort. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the tremors slowed, the breathing deepened, and a faint color returned to its ears. Only then did Arakath step forward to stand beside Cade. Before the watching Vorkathi warriors, he placed one massive hand on Cade's shoulder and said, in clear galactic trade tongue, "He is Vorkathi." It was not a gesture given to outsiders. It was an adoption, a claim, a binding of loyalty in a culture where trust was rarer than mercy. The warriors bowed their heads, the movement subtle but unmistakable. Cade glanced at the recovering cub, then at Arakath. "I guess I'm family now." Arakatha's answering growl held something like pride. Until death. The words carried no threat, only certainty. But in the quiet that followed, Cade couldn't shake the thought that the kind of trust he'd been given now would demand more from him than he had ever given before. And he suspected the next test was already coming. The cubs grew fast. Months passed, and the helpless bundles Cade had carried through the jungle became sleek, lean-bodied predators, their muscles rippling under patterned fur, their eyes bright with the restless curiosity of youth. They stalked the camp with the quiet confidence of hunters, slipping between human tents and Vorkathi warriors alike as if they owned the ground. In a way they did. They followed Cade everywhere. When he worked on field reports, they sprawled beside his chair, tails twitching. When he patrolled the jungle perimeter, they shadowed him through the trees, silent except for the occasional playful pounce on his boots. They learned his scent, his voice, and, most importantly, they learned that his orders, like Arakatha's, were to be obeyed without question. It wasn't just him who noticed the bond. Vorkathi warriors began greeting Cade with short, deliberate nods, some even tapping their chests in acknowledgement. Ramos joked that he'd somehow been promoted to alien wolf-tiger uncle, but there was no humor in Arakatha's eyes when he said, "They would kill for you now." That loyalty was tested sooner than Cade expected. One evening, as the light turned gold across the treetops, Arakath summoned him to the Vorkathi gathering ground, a wide, open space ringed by carved stone pillars older than any living being. Warriors stood in a circle, their fur combed and adorned with clawbone tokens. In the center, the cubs, now almost his height when they sat, waited with ears pricked forward, tails low but still. "This is the walk," Arakath said, stepping to Cade's side. "They leave the den, cross into the wild, and survive alone until they return. It is the first step to becoming Vorkathi." Cade nodded slowly. "And you want me here to watch?" "No. I want you to walk with them." The words hung in the air. Several warriors shifted, their ears flicking, but no one spoke against it. The decision had already been made. Still, Cade knew what it meant. Outsiders didn't walk the right. Even Vorkathi from other clans were rarely permitted to take part. If he went, he would not just be witness, he would be bound to them in a way that even saving their lives hadn't sealed. "I'll go," he said simply. The journey began at dawn. The forest was alive with sound, the air cool and sharp. The cubs moved ahead, weaving between trees, pausing only to check that Cade followed. Arakath trailed behind for the first few kilometers, silent and watchful, then stopped when the border stones came into view, tall monoliths etched with claw marks. "From here they go alone," he said. Then after a pause, "But they go with you." Cade stepped over the boundary with the cubs. The jungle beyond was wilder, less forgiving. Roots jutted like traps, and the air carried the sense of larger predators. The cubs were alert but unafraid, their bodies moving with the controlled energy Arakath had drilled into them. The first test came at a river crossing. The water was fast, swollen from recent storms. The larger cub leapt across without trouble, but the smaller misjudged the distance, landing short and slipping into the current. Cade dropped his pack and dove in. The water was icy, the pull strong, but he caught the cub by the scruff and kicked toward shore. They tumbled onto the bank, both coughing, both soaked. The cub shook itself violently, then pressed its head briefly against his chest before bounding after its sibling. They traveled on. Hours blurred into a rhythm of movement, rest, and hunting. Cade carried no firearm. This was their right, not his, but he kept his knife ready. Twice, they circled wide to avoid the scent of larger predators. Once, the cubs brought down a small jungle grazer, sharing the meat with him without hesitation. On the third day, the danger found them. It began with silence, the kind that empties the air of birdsong and insect hum. The cubs froze, ears swiveling. A low vibration reached Cade's feet before he heard the sound itself, the slow, deliberate steps of something heavy moving through the undergrowth. It emerged from the shadows like a nightmare given shape. A Vorkathi not of Arakatha's clan, larger, scarred, and alone. Lone Vorkathi were dangerous. They had nothing to lose and everything to kill for. Its eyes locked on the cubs and its lips peeled back in a slow snarl. Cade stepped between them without thinking, knife in hand. The predator's gaze flicked to him, uncomprehending for a heartbeat, then narrowing in disdain. To it he was prey standing in the way of a real fight. The cubs growled low, circling to flank. Cade kept his stance steady, his voice calm. "Not today." The predator lunged. Cade sidestepped, slashing across its shoulder, the blade biting deep but not enough to stop it. The cubs hit from either side, teeth sinking into fur and flesh. The lone Vorkathi roared, twisting, throwing one cub aside. Cade drove forward, stabbing low into its ribs. It turned on him then, massive paw swinging. The blow caught him across the chest, knocking the air from his lungs. He hit the ground hard, vision flickering. Through the haze, he saw the smaller cub launch itself at the predator's throat, clinging, biting, refusing to let go. The larger cub joined, their combined weight dragging it down. Cade pushed himself up, knife in hand, and drove the blade into the base of its skull. The predator shuddered once, then went still. The cubs released it, panting, fur streaked with blood. They circled back to him, pressing their heads against his legs, their bodies trembling with the aftershock of the fight. "You did well," he said, his voice rough. He wasn't sure if he meant them or himself. By the time they returned to the border stones, the sun was sinking. Arakath waited, the rest of the clan behind him. The cubs padded forward, heads high, their movements deliberate, proof they had faced the wild and survived. Arakath looked past them to Cade. His eyes were steady, his voice carrying for all to hear. "They return as hunters. And so does he." The warriors bowed their heads. One stepped forward and placed a clawbone token in Cade's hand, a hunter's mark, worn only by those who had faced death and returned stronger. The cubs stayed close as the gathering broke apart. Arakath approached, clasping Cade's forearm in a grip like iron. "When they speak of the walk, your name will be in it. They will say you bled for them, fought for them, and walked beside them as one of us." Cade glanced at the cubs, now no longer just wards but something deeper, family forged in blood and trust. "Then they'll know the truth." Arakatha's grin was all teeth. That even predators trust humans with their cubs. The night fell around them, but the air felt lighter. Somewhere deep in the jungle, other predators hunted, other dangers waited. But for now the bond held, unbroken, stronger than the wild itself. The first rain of the wet season came in sheets, hammering the Vorkathi settlement until the carved stone pillars gleamed slick and black. Cade stood beneath the awning of the warriors' hall watching the cubs, no not cubs anymore, sprint through the mud, snapping at each other in mock combat. Their bodies moved with a lethal grace, but the playful yips that slipped between growls reminded him they were still young. Still his. Arakath stepped beside him, fur flattened by moisture, eyes scanning the horizon. "You've heard the news." Cade nodded. He'd heard the whispers all day. A rogue war clan had crossed into Vorkathi territory from the northern ridges. No honor codes, no rights, only hunger for conquest. They would not negotiate. They would take what they could, kill what resisted, and burn the rest. "They'll come for the settlement?" Cade asked. "They'll come for the young," Arakath said, his voice low. "They always do. Break the bloodlines, the clan falls." His gaze slid to Cade. "You know what that means." Cade did. The cubs, his hunters now, were still untested in open war. And the raiders would see them as trophies. The attack came at night. No warning, no challenge. The first alarm was the sharp crack of a watchtower's bone horn, followed by the answering roar of Vorkathi warriors surging into formation. Cade was already moving, his rifle slung and knife at his belt, scanning the shadows for the young hunters. He found them on the eastern wall, fur-bristled, eyes locked on the approaching shapes, tall, lean predators in war paint, their weapons catching the light of the burning outpost they'd left in their wake. "Stay close," Cade told them. They didn't argue. The first wave hit hard, claws scraping stone, voices raised in the guttural battle cries of their clan. Cade fired in controlled bursts, dropping two before they reached the wall. Beside him, the hunters leapt, slamming into raiders with the full force of their weight. The air filled with snarls, the metallic tang of blood, the sharp crack of bone. A larger shape loomed from the smoke, taller than Arakath, armored in scavenged plating. The warlord. He moved with terrifying speed for his size, swatting warriors aside as if they were prey animals. His gaze fixed on Cade's hunters. Cade moved to intercept, firing until the rifle clicked empty, then closing the distance with his knife. The warlord caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting hard enough to send white pain lancing up Cade's arm. He wrenched free, ducked under a claw swipe, and drove the blade into the gap between armor plates. The warlord roared, but the blow wasn't enough. He caught Cade with a backhand that threw him to the ground, breath knocked out, vision swimming. Through the haze, Cade saw the warlord advance on the hunters. They didn't retreat. The larger hunter darted left, drawing the warlord's attention, while the smaller circled behind. They moved in perfect coordination, Arakatha's training overlaid with the wordless trust they'd built with Cade. At the same moment, both lunged, one slamming into the warlord's legs, the other driving claws into his exposed neck. The warlord staggered, swiping wildly. Cade forced himself up, every muscle screaming, and closed the distance. He took the opening they'd given him, driving the knife deep, twisting until the warlord shuddered and collapsed. Silence fell in that sudden jarring way it does after violence. The remaining raiders, seeing their leader fall, broke and ran into the jungle. The Vorkathi didn't pursue. This was victory enough. Arakath approached, eyes scanning the fallen warlord, then flicking to Cade. "You've done it again." Cade shook his head. "We did it." His gaze went to the hunters, their fur matted with blood, some theirs, most not. They stood tall, unflinching under the stares of the warriors. Arakatha's voice carried across the gathering ground. "They fought as Vorkathi. And the human fought as one of us. This is the truth of the bond." Warriors pounded the hilts of their weapons against the stone in unison. The hunters moved to Cade's side, pressing against his legs in silent acknowledgement. Later, when the fires were doused and the wounded tended, Cade sat outside his quarters. The hunters lay at his feet, breathing slow in the rhythm of deep sleep. Arakath joined him, lowering himself with the ease of someone unburdened by ceremony. "You've given them more than survival," the Vorkathi leader said quietly. "You've given them something even we could not." "What's that?" "Faith. That someone will stand for them without blood ties, without clan oath, simply because it is right." Cade looked down at the hunters. They were his now in a way no ritual could claim. "They'd have done the same for me." Arakatha's mouth curved in the rare, sharp grin of his kind. "And that is why even predators trust humans with their cubs." The rain began again, softer this time, hissing against the jungle leaves. Cade leaned back, letting the sound wash over him. Tomorrow there would be more threats, more battles. But tonight there was trust, and there was family, and in a galaxy built on the law of the strongest, that bond was the one thing no predator could break.